Hello, I'm Earl Weinberg, and welcome to Book Circle Presents. This time we begin another story of the Cavalry cycle. If you've heard other stories from the cycle, you know that the cavalry in question is the dedicated cavalry of Grand Normandy, Grand Normandy being a magically hidden nation in England and France for the most part. And this time we discover how Grand Normandy copes with that human universal, death. This is the first reading of Wake. Mrs. Polian looked at the body on the bed, then lifted her own hands and stared down at them. She looked around the room. She stared at Trella, who met her gaze and nodded slightly to her late mistress. "Go in peace," she offered. Mrs. Polian nodded back resignedly, turned away, took a step, and vanished. Trella stared at the eastern wall of the bedroom. The dark tunnel had not really opened there, but that was the impression that lingered. No one had come to meet Mrs. Polian, immortal or ex-mortal, but maybe they would show up further on. The rare ones who came back sometimes said they did. "Travel well," she continued to the wall. "Don't come back." She studied the body closely. You grew so used to bodies being alive, you could fool yourself into thinking you saw breath, but there was none. She went to the parlor and stood in front of the phone. It was an old one, tethered to the wall, black and shiny, with a rotary dial. It was still far too modern to her. Well, a few hot meals paid to that gremlin had fixed that. And it had used up the stew Mrs. Polian had thought too spicy, and the wine that looked common, whatever the hell that had meant, and the perfectly good rolls she simply didn't want, though maybe that had been the illness. Anyway, the phone. "Call the Baron," she told it. A few moments later it rang. She picked it up and held it gingerly to her ear. "Baron Dubosc's residence," a young woman's voice answered. "This is the Reeve." "Return and we return," Trella said. There was a tiny pause while the Reeve realized what she was talking to. "Keep faith and so do we," she answered. Now the conversation between species could continue properly. "Elizabeth Alice Odile Polian is dead," Trella told her. "Oh, is this an emergency?" "No, all very natural and routine for you lot." She heard clicking noises. Probably the Reeve was using computery things. Trella had seen them on the telly, and the gremlin had used one, but Mrs. Polian had never had one. "Who am I addressing?" "You can call me Trella. I do for Mrs. Polian. Well, I did, but I know nothing about laying out bodies or funerals or like that." Mortality was not in her line. "Better get someone over soon. It's warm and all. I'm not sticking around for that, and someone unsundered might notice." Not futlin likely, though, she reflected, given that Bet Polian had just about hung out a shingle reading Professional Recluse these last several years. "The priest and the sexton will be there within a couple of hours," the Reeve replied. "Good," she said, and replaced the handset. "Bye," she added as an afterthought. She looked around the parlor. All proper, a good job. Those flowers could stand replacing, though. But who for? She removed the wilting flowers, went to the kitchen, and left them in the bin. The kitchen was all proper, too. Mrs. Polian's last leftovers were in the fridge, and everything was clean. There was no longer anything required of her. "Hempen, hempen, 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 I will neither work nor stampen," she sang softly to herself. "Here's a cloak and here's a hood, you'll get no mair a brownie's good." But the words hooked in no spell. There had been no cloak and no hood, and she wasn't even Scottish. Mrs. Polian had liked to call her a Luton when she referred to her at all. What did stampen even mean? She stood in the kitchen door and surveyed the immaculate garden. No, There were no more magic strings. She could stay or go as she chose now. Why stay? Well, it was hard to walk away from a job you'd been doing for so long, and so well. And she was curious to see who the next resident of the cottage would be. Maybe they would appreciate her work. Maybe they would be nicer. Meanwhile, this priest and sexton definitely didn't need her, and the garden gate beckoned. It had been over a week since she had passed through it. She stepped out, shutting the kitchen door behind her. For the first time in a very long time, there was absolutely no one in the house. She turned her coat. A fox trotted through the garden, expertly flipped the catch on the gate, and padded into the woods beyond. A horse trailer arrived before anyone else. Charlie Horse emerged, thanked the driver, and bade him goodbye. As the trailer purred away down the road, he looked around. Aunt Bet's was a pretty little cottage, with flowers and a pair of shading oaks in the front, the fenced kitchen yard in back, and bits of lawn on either side. Beyond the kitchen garden lay some forest. If you were perceptive but unsundered, you might wonder about the gate in the fence leading nowhere. But Charlie Horse merely nodded to himself. The cottage roof was slate, not thatch. The stone walls were smartly whitewashed, and a bit of porch over the front door had slender fluted columns. The total impression was that the house was a Georgian-style gatekeeper's cottage. But the grand country house and estate that would match such a structure were not in evidence. Instead, there was a country road with a hedgerow on the far side from the house. Down the road, you would run into more cottages, and finally into the village of Dimble Abbots. On the far side of Dimble Abbots, on another country road, stood the neighboring houses of the Arlingway and Darnley families, where Charlie Horse had grown up, before he had joined the dedicated cavalry and become Charlie Horse. Not far at all, which made it a little odd that he had been to Aunt Bet's house so seldom. Not odd if you knew Aunt Bet, though. There, in the little patch of lawn outside the garden fence, was the grave. Charlie approached. The thudding of his hooves broke the silence. He softened his tread. The grave appeared empty. No doubt just below the soil lay the body. No coffin. Grand Normans bury their dead in simple clothes and a shroud, no more, and without preservation. The sexton had done what was needful and left the rest until the family could be gathered for the graveside ceremony. Charlie heard the sound of an approaching car. He had a glamoured neckerchief that would make him look like a man on horseback, and should have had it ready, but there was no time now. He stepped off the lawn into the shrubbery at the edge of the wood and crouched down. The car slowed, pulled off in front of the cottage, and disgorged the priest and the sexton, both in their formals. Since it was safe, Charlie stood. A moment too late, he realized what a surprise he must be. The two new arrivals stared open-mouthed. They saw a large young man rising out of the bracken, wearing a dark bushy beard and a cowboy hat. But as he kept rising, they saw the body of a dark bay horse. The sheer surprise on their faces altered, and Charlie Horse realized that, for a pleasant change, he was being stared at in wonder, not astonishment, alarm, or disgust. And back at the base, of course, he was a commonplace sight. He smiled. "Sorry to startle you," he told them. "Oh, quite all right," said the priest, Father Lanton, Charlie remembered, a slim, gray-haired man in black clericals, wearing the fleur-de-lis cross of the Avenese Church, in blue enamel and gold, as a pin on his lapel. He came over, hand extended, smiling up at Charlie, still wondering. "Charles Arlingway? Lucille Arlingway's boy?" Charlie's smile broadened. "Yes, sir, she raised me, but I'm a Darnley," he said, correcting as they shook. "Aunt Lou was my mother's aunt, Aunt Bet's sister." "Ah, yes," said Luton, "but I did remember it was Lucille's boy that, decided to get transformed, and so kicked up a fuss in his family. How to phrase that? "Enlisted in the dedicated cavalry," Charlie Horse finished for him. He sharpened the smile. time and change happen to us all, he paraphrased from Ecclesiastes. Indeed, and this is Glenn Ramsay, our sexton. Charlie shook hands with a younger, sturdier man in black suit and tie, wearing boots and carrying a pair of gardening gloves tucked into his back pocket. Charlie felt Ramsay and Lanton were bursting with questions, but then 3 more cars showed up. Charlie started to retreat again, but recognized them and watched his family as they got out, all in their soberest clothes. "Charles!" cried his sister Lily. She ran over and hugged him around the waist. He knelt so they could hug properly, then collected hugs from his sister Iris and his cousin Alex. Aunt Constance kissed him on the cheek. Uncle Nathan shook his hand. More relatives milled about. Some greeted him, some did not. His parents greeted the priest, then took up position near the grave, never glancing his way. Uncle Mark glared at him outright, backed up by Aunt Eleanor's sour expression. "You call that suitable for a funeral?" he challenged. Charlie Horse wore a bright red jacket with white piping, and his Stetson was a vivid blue. It matched the light blanket over his equine back, which bore the arms of Grand Normandy on each side. His hooves had been polished, his tail combed, his coat brushed, and his beard trimmed, and the quick sojourn in the bushes had done no harm. "This is dress uniform, Uncle Mark," he answered. "It's what military wear on formal occasions. And there's this." He indicated a wide black band on his right arm. Uncle Mark snorted. "How did you even get here?" demanded Eleanor. "Cavalry trailer, of course, available at 8 hours' notice." Once greetings were done, everyone assembled around the grave, and the service proper began. Standing at the edge was a little tricky, because everyone else seemed to want to stand at the edge, too. He studied the proxemics of the situation. There were Lanton and Ramsay. Their jobs put them at the graveside. Almost 2 meters away from the grave stood his mother and father, their backs to him. Of course, she did not want to look at Charlie Horse, and his father would go along. His mother was the nearest to a fan of Aunt Bet that the family could offer. Further out stood the rest of the family, a scattering of Arlingways and Darnleys, almost too far away, as if wanting to dissociate them from the burial, from the deceased. Only there was no "as if" about it. Arlingways and Darnleys, but no Polians. When the family had arrived, Charlie Horse had seen everyone peer about for any newly revealed Polians, but there had been none. In particular, there had been no Mr. Dieter Polian, Uncle Dieter, Aunt Bet's husband, who had failed to come back from a business trip in 2005. Lanton read the 23rd Psalm and ended with, "Give her eternal peace, Lord, and let everlasting light shine on her." Silently, hesitantly, Charlie Horse's mother took a pinch of earth from the pile beside the grave and dropped it in. Other family members followed. Charlie, Lily, and Alex, having stood furthest away, were the last. "Requiem aeternam dona, Domine, et lux perpetua luceat ei," Charlie Horse murmured as he dropped in his handful. "I'm sure she would have preferred Latin," he said in an aside to his sister and cousin. Iris pursed her lips, Lily raised her eyebrows, but they all nodded. "What now?" Uncle Nathan asked Father Lanton. "We should," began the priest, but a high, sharp voice interrupted, "Return and we return." Everyone turned toward the sound and saw a fox perched on the fence post by the garden gate. Everyone knew by family lore that this must be Trella, even if they had never seen her before. "Keep faith, and so do we," came a ragged chorus from most of the family. "I don't know much about funerals," said the fox, "but I know there's a reception afterward, or there can be. Come in." She jumped down into the garden and disappeared from view. Everyone stared at everyone else, heard no objections, and started through the gate. Only Ramsay the sexton turned away and started shoveling. "Come in as soon as you're finished, Glenn," the Lanton told him. "You were invited too." Ramsay nodded. Charlie Horse knew he had also been invited, but wondered how far to take it. The cottage rooms were small. He had felt cramped the last time he was here, a few years back, even though he had been fully human then. He hesitated at the kitchen door. Maybe sit in the garden and look in through a window. But "You too," Trella piped from somewhere, so he took off his hat, ducked, and followed Iris in. He exhaled to fit his horse ribs through the door. His hips left horsehair on the doorframe. The kitchen looked exactly as he recalled it, though he had last seen it from more than a foot nearer the floor. And any evidence of preparation for the reception had already been cleaned away. Of course. The dining room had been rearranged for a buffet brunch. Tables had been moved to the side of the room and stocked with food. People were going to eat off little side tables, or with plates on their knees, those who had conventional knees. But there was also a clear space by one wall, with a braided rug on the floor. Charlie recognized his seat. He moved slowly and carefully through the room and settled down, looking about the room as he did so. Almost everyone was staring at him, or at least glancing. The only exceptions were his parents, who were turned away, engaging Father Lanton. Lanton was glancing from them to Charlie Horse and back. Charlie Horse caught himself trying to avoid people's eyes, trying to look blank and unengaged. This would not do. It was the kind of thing he had done before he was changed. He had not become a stallion to be timid. With deliberation, he smiled at Lanton and looked around the room, tallying his family. Not all of them were here. His cousins Bev and Julia were in Calais and London respectively. His brother Oliver was in Durham, too far to come on the short notice required of Grand Norman funerals. That still left 17. He turned his attention to the food. He sat next to a table bearing a silver tray of dark brown muffins. They were good. What else was on offer, he wondered, and how was he going to get to it? He looked around, but listening told him more than looking. Gooseberry fool! Oh, I love gooseberry fool! This sesame chicken is Chinese takeaway. Breaded mushrooms, do you think they're all right? They look wild. Oh, they must be. Why not? It's just that, well, hardly anything poisons them. She cooked it for us, and she knows her stuff. There, you watch me for signs of falling over. These aren't crepes, they're mouchi. What's this stuffing? Diced apples and sour cream? I don't recognize this silver. Try the apple cobbler. This is bilberry pie. I remember these napkins, they're from Ireland. Mulberry tarts, apple tarts, plum tarts, blackberry tarts. When did she have time to do all this? You ask that about a brownie? Look at all these tiny eggs. And this is crispy fried shelf fungus. What kind of jelly is this? Rowan berry, and this is apple butter. She stuffed these fortune cookies with something. What's in the third samovar? Says acorn tea. I never knew Aunt Bet had all these samovars. Charlie Horse took another nibble of muffin. Tea, acorn or regular, would go well with it, but he wasn't sure he wanted to cross the room to get it, scattering relatives before him like leaves before an autumn gale. He didn't have to. At that moment, Lily came up to him with a plate stacked with food, a teacup nestled against some biscuits. Alex appeared with a second plate, piled twice as high. Oh, now this is too, Alex cut him off. We're just trying to scale up. There's plenty. Just look around, Lily said. Well, at least share with me. They shared. Alex pulled up a chair. Lily sat on Charlie, and they put the plates on a nearby table. What are those muffins? Lily asked. Acorn with berries, Charlie answered. She's done a lot with acorns. There's the tea and bread and shelled glazed acorns, probably other stuff. Did Aunt Bet like forest food? Lily asked doubtfully. Charlie had heard a lot about Aunt Bet, having been raised by Aunt Lou, Bet's sister. No, she didn't trust it, was afraid it was dirty or poisonous. He savored another bite of acorn muffin. I bet Trella has been waiting years to bust out these recipes. She's been waiting years to cook anything, I should think, said Aunt Constance, who had been standing near and now turned to join in. These last few years, Bet was living on takeaway. Like the mouchi crepes? Asked Alex. Oh, no, hated Chinese food, and Indian, and Thai. So that lets out the Happy Walk, Alex inferred. This was the only Oriental restaurant in Dimble Abbots, a tiny establishment run by one versatile Pakistani. She had 4 restaurants in Lefgate that she liked, Constance told them. Well, 2 or 3 at any given time. Then one would use too much pepper or forget to leave the capers out of the salad or something, and she'd drop it and forgive one of the others. All that way? Lily asked. For takeaway? Every day? Takeaway only after she left off driving, and more like every other day or every third, with leftovers in between. But she did put a lot of miles on her car in her driving days. Then she paid to have it delivered. Had to change her list of restaurants, which I heard was a sore trial. How did she afford it? Asked Alex. She didn't do anything else, Constance answered. I thought she was all about trading in antiques and occultics, said Lily. Charlie looked around the room. Eggshell white walls with molding and sills a careful 3 shades more beige. Furniture from the 18th century, or looking like it. Dark woods carved in delicate, spindly forms that had made him nervous enough when he'd been a hulking teenage boy in mid-growth spurt. Not that one, Aunt Bet had commanded, pointing from one chair to another. That one's sturdier. And that was more than 1,000 pounds ago. One rack of shelves contained hand-painted egg cups. Another displayed Venetian glass paperweights. Constellations of silhouettes and cameos decked the walls. The table next to him had a display case built under it containing drolleries. A ceramic mug shaped like a frog, a brown glass bottle shaped like a fish, a toy bank looking like Punch and Judy. Antiques, yes, he said, but I don't see a lot of occultics. Said the mythical beast, returned Alex. I don't count. I was transformed by magic, but I'm not doing any. I can barely feel out spells. I think I feel something in this print, said Lily, pointing over her head to a hand-tinted print of a landscape. She rose from Charlie's back and took it down. She looked at it for a moment, then gazed into nowhere. I think there's a charm on it that keeps the colors from fading. She passed it to Alex, who ran a hand over it, not touching. He nodded, then passed it to Charlie, who stared through it rather than at it. There's a little charm here, he agreed, but I can't tell what it does. You're ahead of me on analysis, Sweets. He returned the picture to Lily. You'd never have dared take that down when Bet was alive, Constance remarked. Certainly not, Lily agreed. Not unless she told me to. But title is passed. To? Asked Alex. I suppose, Constance began. Dieter, said Uncle Mark, joining the conversation as Constance had by turning around. Constance pursed her lips at the interruption, but nodded. Lily sat back down on her brother, earning her a glassy glance of disapproval from Mark, and said, I thought he was dead. Not as of 10 months ago, Mark told her. He sent back some papers Bet asked him to sign, and she passed them on for us to file. The young people understood us to mean their parents' generation of the family. So they're separated, Alex inferred. Very, Constance said, but we get paperwork from him 3 or 4 times a year. 10 months was a long gap, but I suppose Beth didn't get around to much business correspondence in her decline. I wonder if he knows she's dead, said Charlie Horse. Excellent question, said Constance. Mark gave him a short glare, apparently for daring to speak at all. Charlie and Constance had spoken into one of those chance lulls that happen in small groups. Hearing them, Father Lanton said, Ah, and tapped his teacup with his spoon to ring for attention. I have one more bit of official business, he told the family. You need to know that Mrs. Polian died intestate, without a will, so far as we know. As Mr. Arlingway has just pointed out, this means her property passes to her husband Dieter Polian, if he is still alive. He would be 96, but apparently he made it to 95. I gather he and Mrs. Polian were estranged, but he should still be notified, both because of the inheritance and out of basic decency. Mark harumphed. There's the rub. We don't know how to contact him. Bet did all the contacting. A few months ago, said Uncle Nathan, when it was clear she was declining, I asked her about contacting Dieter. She just gave me this sour look and said nothing. He sighed. We must just search for contact information and, of course, put out public notices. Mark grunted again. We need an inventory, too. Dieter won't last much longer if he's alive at all, and there's no telling what kind of will he's made. If we make an inventory now and swear out an affidavit, it could save trouble later. Constance sighed. People can get very twisty about inheritance, she said. the rest of the senior generation agreed. The junior generation spoke up in the person of Charlie Horse. "I'll do it," he said. "Start it, at least." Everyone stared at him. Even his parents forgot to not look. "You can barely stuff yourself into these rooms," Mark objected. "Barely, but I can," Charlie answered. "I've had practice, stuffing lessons." He shrugged. "I don't sleep much, so I can work through the night. It's something useful I can do. Potentia proservientes, you know." This was the motto of the dedicated cavalry. Strength for service. Well, good," said Uncle Mark, groping for words other than thank you. Uncle Nathan said it instead. "Thank you, Charles. It's very—" He paused, interrupted by Charlie's mother murmuring something to him. "Really, Evelyn, you could just as well ask him your—" But she had turned away. Charlie had watched her face closely, but she had refused eye contact. Nathan sighed and said, "Your mother asks for you to look for a framed sampler, letters and numbers and the Lord's Prayer in French. I know the one she means." "She gave it to Bet as a Christmas present," Constance added, "and she's always wondered what she did with it." So, a house full of enchantments, a missing heir, and a protagonist who has volunteered to take inventory. You'll find out where this begins to lead next time.